Hello, I am Ephraim Cañete, and today we will discuss about k-means clustering. Clustering is grouping features together with coherent subsets. Understand how data are related with each other. Here are some applications of cluster analysis. Number one is grouping companies together that behave in the same fluctuation of stock prices. Second, a recommender system that will group user behavior and give recommendation. Third, climate analysis by clustering precipitation. And four, image segmentation for clustering tumor growth in the brain. Early application of cluster in 1854, clustering showed that the outbreak occurs nearest to cholera-contaminated water pump. K-means is an unsupervised method of clustering groups data points into k-groups in which each observation belongs to the cluster with the nearest mean, so as to minimize the sum of squares criterion. So our input is k number of clusters in the training set x, where xi is an Rn dimensional vector. Step 2, part 1. Cluster assignment step. Form k-cluster by assigning all data points to the closest centroid. For I is equal to 1 to k, ci is the index from 1 to k of cluster centroid closest to xi. Step 2, part 2, move centroid step. Recompute the centroid of each cluster. For j is equal to 1 to k, mu k is the average of points assigned to cluster j. Repeat 1 and 2 until the centroid don't change. Let's look at an example. Figure B, select initial cluster centroid. Figure C, assign data points to the nearest centroid as measured by Euclidean distance. Figure D, compute mu cluster centroid. Repeat step C and D as needed to achieve best possible within cluster variance. So there are limitations of k-means. One is we have different sizes. Second, different densities. Third, non-globular shapes. And fourth, k-means a problem also when the data contain an outlier. Let's look at our example. So here we will use iris dataset, and then we need to remove the other data that we don't need. And the next is for modeling data. We need to understand how many clusters do we need to use, which is in this case, the optimal number of clusters is 3 using the elbow method. And next is we will visualize the data. As you can see, they're incorrectly classified. Some of species are virginica and some of the species are versicolor. So the limitation of k-means in different sizes. So the original data point is this. Visually, we can categorize it clearly, but using k-means and using 3 clusters, we will have this particular classification. In order for us to minimize the limitation, one solution is to use many clusters to find parts of the clusters later on, put them together. There are other variations to minimize this limitation. The first is the k-medioids, where we will use the centroid of the cluster to be the one of the points in the cluster. And the next is k-centered. The main goal is to minimize the maximum diameter of the cluster. There are other algorithms that we can use as an alternative to k-means. First is the hierarchical clustering. We need to produce a nested cluster organized as a hierarchical tree. And next is the DB scan, partition points into dense region separated by not so dense region. That's the end of my presentation.